listener production. Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Our $368 billion submarine deal with the US and the UK has once again been thrust into the spotlight after the US re-elected a president who's putting America first and who doesn't seem to be prioritising the deal. Should we just cut our losses and ditch AUKUS?
We are an island nation with a whole lot of water surrounding us, and it's clear at the moment we're not capable of defending that on our own. That's never been Australia's strategy. You need partners, you need friends.
That's coming up in the second half of this episode. But first, time for the headlines as always with Chris Spyrou on Wednesday, March 19.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Donald Trump's phone call with Vladimir Putin discussing a US proposed and Ukraine-backed ceasefire has just wrapped after at least 90 minutes. This is a developing story, but what we know at the time of recording is that Russia has agreed to not strike Ukrainian energy infrastructure for the next 30 days and a swap of 175 prisoners of war on each side. That's according to a Kremlin readout that's just been issued. It goes on to lay out Russia's demands for an end to foreign military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine.
The White House has also issued a statement confirming details of the temporary energy ceasefire, saying Russia has also committed to take part in immediate negotiations for a full and permanent end to the war, which means no immediate end to the fighting, which obviously is disappointing. I think people had maybe been expecting something to come from this phone call, but we will continue to wait. Now, the talks for this full and permanent end to the war will begin immediately in the Middle East, but whether or not that involves Ukraine isn't yet known. The White House statement also says Trump and Putin discussed the need to improve bilateral relations. Now, this is, again, talking about that tilt of the US towards being much more pro-Russia, which is, it's hard to believe we are here. The White House says these talks and this bilateral relationship could bring enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability.
Yeah, and this is something that Russia's really been pushing for in the weeks leading up to this second phone call between Trump and Putin. According to insiders, they've been making the case to the US that you don't have to go to Ukraine for rare earth minerals. We've got them here. Come bring your big industries here and your mining here. They've also been talking a lot about space in the last week, hinting, being like, we can work with Elon Musk. They're really making themselves palatable to this second Trump administration. Something that Kremlin statement also had was that they're committing to organising hockey matches in the US and Russia. Now, the White House hasn't commented or confirmed that, but it's interesting to see how we've got these developments in trade in space, which is a huge US-Russia tension point, and now sport, which we know is a huge way that countries can form, further ties and alliances.
Well, soft diplomacy at play, because that's what makes the ordinary person go, oh, they're okay. Like, we should work with Russia. We should work with the US. They're playing hockey here. Like, oh, look, it's fun. Yeah, that is a huge exercise in soft diplomacy.
Yeah, and while, Putin and Russia have done a relatively good job at combating Western sanctions over the last 3 years, turning to BRICS, those countries, Brazil, India, and those other countries that are traditionally looked at as anti-West, there's no doubt that when he's seeing this opportunity to talk with Trump and to bolster US relations, he's going to take it and he's going to have a crack. And, that's what I think we're seeing happening here.
Staying overseas, world leaders have condemned Israel after it launched further airstrikes on Gaza, which have now killed more than 400 people, many of those children. Now, this all comes after a stall in ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and Israel. Israel is blaming Hamas for the renewed strikes after the group denied requests to extend the first phase of their deal, which ended at the beginning of the month. Originally, an end to phase 1 would trigger phase 2, which were discussions for a permanent and lasting ceasefire and exchange of all remaining hostages and prisoners. Neither side has been able to agree on what the next phase will look like and is blaming the other for the lack of progress. So we found ourselves in this position, Chris, where Israel is saying, well, nothing's happening, we're starting up strikes again.
Yeah, and look, they're saying that they're not targeting civilian populations, they're targeting terrorist cells, but we do know that women and children have been killed in these latest strikes. Look, this has not been very popular in Israel itself. I mean, amongst the extreme right and the right, this is popular. This is what they want. They wanted a, quote, end to Hamas and end to terrorism in the region. But amongst the population and amongst those who still have family in Gaza, hostages in Gaza, they're criticising the government, and they're saying that this is just another power grab by Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, a reminder, his government is incredibly fragile. He is extremely reliant on right-wing members of his party. If they pull out of the party, Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer the PM of Israel. So there are politics at play here. I guess the horrible thing is that you're playing with the lives of innocent people. And I guess what the global community now wants is a leader who's making a decision that's in the interest of humankind, not power.
We've been given a sneak peek into what will be included in next week's budget from the government.
There'll be more cost of living help in the budget. The form of that will be made clear to you over the course of the next week or so. It will be meaningful and substantial, and it will be responsible. It will be affordable. We can't do everything that we would like to do because of the fiscal and other constraints that we have, but there'll be cost of living help. The form of that, you have to tune in a week from now.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers speaking at the Queensland Media Club there, basically saying, stay tuned, guys. He's also confirmed money will be stashed away in this budget to cover some major announcements that will come during the imminent election campaign, which we are still actually waiting to officially kick off.
Yeah, so what cost of living measures might we be able to look forward to? Well, we can likely rule out of any big surprise handouts. Relief will look similar to what we saw in the last budget, like the $300 electricity bill subsidy, and that's because inflation is still lurking and any announcement will have to avoid driving up that figure. As for how the government is feeling about Australia's economic future more broadly, Chalmers says he doesn't expect the budget bottom line to be substantially different from the last update in December, which pointed to $112.8 billion four-year deficit. But he does insist Australia has turned a corner and is on the right track.
Yeah, unsurprising. Of course, he's going to say that. But we have also had a response from the coalition on this because they'll also be sitting there ready to pick this apart because, the fact that Labor has to hand down this budget before the election, with everything that's going on in the global economy as well, would not be something that they wanted to do, as we know. Now, the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, along with the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume, have both laid out this series of tests for the upcoming budget. So they say this budget needs to restore standards of living, reduce inflation, restore prosperity and create opportunity, as well as restore budget discipline. Again, that's of course what we can expect to come from the opposition, that they're going to say, any hint that things aren't hunky-dory and going well and that Aussies are still struggling, it's a failure. In their reply to Chalmers' speech, they said that the country can't afford another 3 years of Labor, that people are doing it tough and that we need change. Look, cost of living relief is still desperately needed as well. There was a report out yesterday called the Priced Out Report, and it revealed that Australian renters need an annual income of $130,000 to comfortably rent an average unit. So this is a single person renting on their own. Now, the report said the median salary right now is about $72,000. Northern WA, the Gold Coast and Sydney are the top three places where Aussies are spending the biggest portion of their wages on housing, according to this report. And, so for Northern WA, it was 55% of $100,000 that people were spending on rent. On the Gold Coast, it was 54%, and in Sydney, it was 48%. Rental stress is defined as a person spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So we can see just how much people are forking out. It is clear that more work still needs to be done in this space as well. And, whether that's something that Labor is going to include in the budget, we'll have to wait and see.
And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to find.
And it's the moment they've been waiting for 9 very long months. Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore have finally left the International Space Station and will be back on Earth this morning. Our time, Sasha Barbagat.
Yay! I don't know why. I actually nearly started crying just listening to Elton just then. Those poor people, they're finally coming home.
They are. And this is actually audio of them pulling out of the ISS yesterday morning, our time.
All hooks are open and undocking confirmed. Freedom is free of its moorings. Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore begin their belated trip home.
Separation confirmed.
Oh, chills, actual chills. The 17-hour journey will come to an end just before 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time when the SpaceX Dragon capsule splashes down in waters off the Florida coast. They'll then be helicoptered back to dry land to reunite with their loved ones, bringing to an end their months-long stay in space that was only supposed to last 8 days.
No, the astronauts were seen on NASA's live footage laughing and hugging and posing for photos with their colleagues from the station shortly before they were shut into the capsule for 2 hours, which includes, final pressure communications and SEAL tests. So they would have been feeling, I can't imagine actually the feeling of getting into that capsule finally after such a long ordeal. And remember, this was dragged out. They initially had, capsules, they tried to repair the capsule, the Boeing capsule that took them up. They were trying to send other missions to go get them. It has been a long, drawn-out process. Now, we did talk on Monday in the headlines about all the things that happen to your body when you're in space for a really long time. I won't, run over them again. Go back and have a listen because it's really, really interesting. It's fascinating. Also, get our numbers up. But they will have to undergo this intense physio once they are back on land. But, a lot of the impacts do kind of fade over time, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Also, anxiety and depression are really common for returning astronauts, especially ones that might have gone through an ordeal like Sonny and Butch. Now, this one, which I talked about on Monday, but I'm going to bring up again, the overview effect, which I found this beautiful quote that describes what that is. And it's astronauts who have seen the Earth from space have often described the overview effect as an experience that has transformed their perspective of the planet and mankind's place upon it and enabled them to perceive it as our shared home without boundaries between nations or species, which is just such an incredible thought that these two will come back down to Earth and experience this understanding of the fragility of the human race. I just think it's incredible.
Yeah, and if anyone's going to know what that feeling is like, it's definitely Sonny Williams. She's, broken records while up in space. She's completed the second most spacewalks by a woman in space. So, she's had this opportunity to head out of the ISS and have a look at Earth and get like this really extraordinary picture. I'm sure those moments will be things that she misses. The lack of fresh air, I'm sure she's not missing. The lack of proper showering, I'm sure she's not missing and really, really keen to get home to do.
And Butch as well.
And Butch as well.
Blokes like showers too, Chris.
We do.
I hope you do anyway. That's happening just before 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. If you're listening to this before that moment, I'm sure there'll be a live stream of that happening. All right, Chris, thank you so much. Next up, we're getting into your deep dive looking at AUKUS and whether it's time to just ditch it.
Let's talk AUKUS. Not the majestic killer whales, but the trilateral security deal we have with the UK and the US. It was first announced in 2021 by then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, or as Joe Biden famously called him at the time,
that fella down under.
Alongside Rishi Sunak and his US counterpart, Scotty gave us some idea of what we were getting ourselves into. Top line, it was a deal for nuclear-powered submarines that would replace our ageing fleet. The perks, they're far more difficult to detect, can remain underwater for months on end, and have the ability to fire longer-range missiles with more precision and damage. On top of that, they have advanced capabilities in the fields of quantum tech, cyber warfare, and AI. In a nutshell, they're a submariners and spies' dream. Now let's fast forward to 2023, where the picture became a whole heap clearer.
The AUKUS agreement we confirm here in San Diego represents the biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history.
It was there in sunny San Diego that Australia committed to buy at least 3 of the subs from the US in the next decade and build another 5 of its own based on a UK design. And those were to be delivered by the mid-2050s. We also promised to recruit and train an entire domestic workforce who could build and work on the subs, create new submarine construction yards and bases, and when the time comes, dispose of the nuclear waste on our own soil. The cost? Well, it's estimated to be up to $368 billion over the next 3 decades, of course, as the government keeps reminding us time and time again. Oh, and there's also one teeny tiny condition. The US hand over the subs at their own discretion, meaning if they're not meeting their own production targets, which they aren't right now, we might not ever see their subs flying an Australian flag. And now with a new US president, Donald Trump, who is pursuing an America First policy and had this to say when asked about AUKUS a few weeks back.
What does that mean?
It comes as no surprise that calls to end our involvement with AUKUS are ramping up. The latest and strongest one coming from ex-PM Malcolm Turnbull.
Will Donald Trump like it? Well, of course he'd like it. It's such a bad deal for us. His only thing would be back of his mind, he'll be thinking, who are these dumb guys that agreed to this deal?
But despite all the historical criticism and the latest criticism, the government and coalition aren't budging. It's a lot to unpack, and whether or not AUKUS remains a worthwhile investment is a question on most Aussie minds right now. Joining me is Charles Croucher, Nine's chief political editor. Charles, I'll start with a loaded question. Is it time Australia leaves AUKUS?
Look, I don't think leaving AUKUS is as easy as Malcolm Turnbull makes it sound. And what we would do if we did leave AUKUS is it puts us back yet another collection of years and billions of dollars behind where we need to be when it comes to defending Australia. AUKUS gives Australia a pretty unique opportunity in that it, A, puts us at the centre of the US Pacific strategy, which we probably already are pretty high up already. But what it really does is gives us the capabilities to have nuclear-powered submarines. These are the phrase that all the defence types use are apex predators, but really they are one of the few things that can make a huge difference when it comes to a battlefield in any potential war in the future. There's only 6 nations that have them. We would become the 7th, and it would be the first time the US have shared their technology. Now, before any of that, we're going to buy a couple of old US subs, Virginia class, about $5 billion each, if you don't mind. But look, we are an island nation with a whole lot of water surrounding us, and it's clear at the moment we're not capable of defending that on our own. That's never been Australia's strategy. You need partners, you need friends. And the first thing John Wayne used to do was get a posse together. That's effectively what Australia is trying to do here and trying to team up with what is usually the biggest kid in the playground in the United States. Some of the critics now worry that their loyalty may not be there, and that's why this has come up again.
A lot of analysis has come out to say that this is a specifically China-targeted policy and pact in a way that we're trying to protect ourselves from Chinese military expansion. Could you paint a little bit of a picture as to what China has as part of its arsenal at the moment that Australia needs to be worried about?
Yeah, a lot of that isn't known as well, just how advanced China's technologies are. I mean, they are much more secretive as a state. So they would have similar capabilities. We don't fully know. They are one of the nuclear-powered groups and one of the with nuclear-powered boats. The big challenge for Australia becomes not just protecting our waters and our shores from old-school war, that is, people on boats arriving and attacking, but also things like underwater cables, shipping lanes. A lot of data runs from Australia up through cables under the sea. There's also these hugely important shipping lanes. And what we saw during COVID, and people remember what happened in the Suez Canal, when one shipping lane gets disrupted, be it through that boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal or more recently the attacks from Houthi rebels on container ships and on cargo ships, everything slows down. And we've built this really interconnected society, which makes stuff cheaper and easier to get and improves standards of living. But if one little link of that supply chain gets disrupted, then things get thrown out of whack. Now, it's annoying when it happens during peacetime. It can be potentially deadly if it happens during wartime. And that's part of the benefit of subs as well, as protecting some of those underwater or shipping lane assets as well. Look, China is rising. We know that there is this difficulty where you weigh up, are we walking ourselves, slow walking into a war when 2 major powers all of a sudden rise? Usually, it's Malcolm Turnbull likes to talk about the Thucydides trap. This is usually when there is conflict. Didn't happen with the UK and America to a great extent when they took over as the most powerful powerful nation in the world. We hope it doesn't happen again. If it is that China is taking over, that's no guarantee. But what Australia is doing is in a few fold. One, really expanding our trading partnerships. That's a way of keeping people on side. Two, with AUKUS, and then three, with these new alliances. The big one of those is the Quad, which involves the US again, showing our importance there, but also brings in Japan and India, important because they are big, powerful countries, India in particular, big expanding and growing country, but also they are traditional adversaries of China and they're on either side. So you're kind of encircling around, keeping an eye on China, if nothing else. Having a big stick helps, and that's what AUKUS is all about. A big stick with plenty of risks as well.
Yeah, and one of those risks that Malcolm Turnbull keeps harping on about is the risk of Donald Trump and this 2.0 presidency, saying this erratic behaviour is something that we need to be mindful of and we need to start pivoting. But is there any evidence to suggest that maybe Australia just, will end up on the cutting room floor when it comes to US foreign policy?
Quite possibly. I mean, I think at the moment there is a benefit to the US in having Australia on board. We are an ally where they can dock their boats, both the warships and the nuclear-powered submarines. They can store their marines. They've got intelligence bases and all the rest here. So we give a value beyond what some of the other allies have done as well. What Donald Trump has done has completely upended the world order, these established norms and rules and alliances that plenty would argue have made America great in the past and helped make Australia great as well. He has come in as the ultimate disruptor, although Elon Musk would argue that's him, and effectively shown very little regard for things that have happened in the past. The tariffs, not just on Australia, but particularly Canada and Mexico. He is flirting with the idea of pulling out of NATO, or at least some of the advisors and senators that are around him are. That would be a disruption of the world's most powerful military alliance in history if that were to happen. Malcolm Turnbull was one of those that pushed for French submarines when Australia was trying to replace the old Collins class. There was Japanese for a while. It was two of those people in his cabinet and on his National Security Committee in Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison that really first got AUKUS up and running and then eventually landed by, while they'll argue about it forever, Anthony Albanese at that ceremony in March in 2023 over in San Diego that I was at. So, look, that's what's worrying Malcolm Turnbull, that this deal has all these get-out clauses for the US and very few for Australia. From the start, there has been this group of defence officials, politicians that have pointed out the risk to sovereignty, and that is that we wouldn't have control of the boats at some stage. Now, the first phase, we've got US boats coming here. We've got some of our submariners on board US nuclear-powered submarines. We're learning over there. Second phase, the Brits come in. Third phase, we have a permanent rotation through Perth. Eventually, it builds up to what is the actual third phase, which is we're building the boats here in Australia. We're using the style that's been designed at the SSN AUKUS. We're storing them and docking them in Perth and somewhere on the East Coast. It becomes a big manufacturing idea. Until then, there is a concern that the US hold the keys. They ultimately hold all the cards, to use a Donald Trump phrase. And there is a problem if at some stage they want out or they want to see things change. We're not in a position where we can do a whole lot to push back. Now, our Collins-class submarines are already aging. They've aged even further. And we could be left with this big gap where Australia doesn't have a functioning fleet of submarines. That would be a problem. Now, Donald Trump specifically, there's enough people around him that support AUKUS. There is a collection of senators, congressmen, advisors that know the value of the alliance, and he won't be there in 2032. He's out as of 2028. The question then becomes, we don't know who will be there, and that's a whole other story, but that is the risk you run in any project that is this big and for this long.
What would you say to those amongst the Australian public right now who are saying we're living through a cost of living crisis, we're living through a housing crisis, there's 3.7 million Australians who struggle to feed themselves. Why are we spending this amount of money on defence?
It all makes total sense. That's a fair argument to make. The full $368 billion price tag that was named for AUKUS isn't all coming now. That is done out over a series of decades. So it's not like we're taking money directly now and spending off. But look, that's all defence spending, right? At some stage, you have to weigh up the life that people are leading and how to improve that compared to potentially averting a threat. Now, the best defence spending is money that never has to be used, or for defence equipment that never has to be used. You don't want to be firing shots because that means that you're in a war. There is a bigger threat to our way of life, and that is a threat from invasion or disruption or anything that upends this world order that we are living in, that it's a constant battle that governments have. It's one this government's having. And the thing we've seen Donald Trump call out Europe for, and NATO allies, European allies in particular, is not pulling their weight. This will increase Australia's percentage that they spend on defence. You're right, that takes money away from education and hospitals and roads and helping the lives of others and tax cuts. And it's the juggle. That's the juggle they have. You know, the Greens would argue till they're red in the face that this is money that we are spending in the wrong direction. The major parties seem pretty steadfast that they think this is the right option. This gives Australia the best protection against that major disruption, because after all, we are a nation of 27 million people with a big coastline and lots of water around us. Defending ourselves on our own isn't a possibility, so you do it as a pack.
Well, as much as I would love to dig into the geopolitics of, Australia leaning more into the Anglosphere and moving away from its regional allies and partners, we just don't have the time to. But I do want to raise another criticism that this whole AUKUS ordeal brings up, and it's that simple fact that technology rapidly expands in a way that we could see exponential growth and development even in the nuclear submarine space that could render these nuclear-powered subs somewhat redundant. Those that you've spoken to who have the technological know-how and the expertise, what are they saying on that point?
That's a fair question. It is. This is simply the best technology you can get now. We've had this same argument with the big fleet of F-35 fighter jets Australia acquired from the US and whether they would still be the cream of the crop, the jewel in the crown, the apex predator. There's no guarantee. You can sort of only play with the cards that are in front of you or with the pieces that are on the board at the moment. This is clearly not a game, but that's the best analogy I can think of. And you are then relying on the research and development, again, not just of Australian scientists that will be benefiting from working on these boats, but the US as well, and the UK. And then when it broadens out to the I think it's called Tier 2 partners, you start bringing in Japan and South Korea and New Zealand, and you're casting the broadest possible net so that if technology improves, if we do make our way forward, be it through old-fashioned research and development, through AI, through things that smarter people than I do, than me talk about, then you're on their side. And then they're going to let you in on the secret, or at least let you in on the technology. Now, you're paying an awful price for it, but what's the other option? You're not paying that price and you're not in with them.
Before we let you go, Charles, a key criticism of this is that from Scott Morrison's announcement in 2021 to today, this has never stopped receiving bipartisan support. There is a common feeling among the Australian public that we've never had the opportunity to have our say on something like this. And let's be honest, it is a mammoth spending task and commitment. Why do you think in an election year, Labor is backing this in so strongly right now?
Firstly, I mean, it will become a budget item, so it will have to be voted on when the money starts coming out. That's one thing. Labor support it, and Richard Marles believes in the product, as does the Prime Minister. Clearly, there is politics at play here, right? You want to look strong. You want to look like you're supporting the nation. You want consistency, which is the hardest thing in any project, to have bipartisan support, so it does have that longevity, because every 3 years we could disrupt the way the parliament's going and that can throw any plan into doubt. Labor believe this is the right option. You ask coalition types around this building, they'll tell you that defence is their strong point. Labor think they can become strong on defence and eat into that a little bit. This would help them. There are parties that will run against this. There is the option to vote against this and vote for those parties, but I don't know, elections are complex. It's rarely up to one issue unless you make it a referendum, which you're not changing the Constitution, so you don't need that. You could do a plebiscite like we last saw with same-sex marriage. There's a couple of options there, but really this is a budget item, so this will be voted on like every other one at some point in the future as the money and the spend gets bigger and bigger. But I think both sides see this as the best way forward. They might argue about the methods involved and how we went about it, but with both sides being briefed in, they've supported this the whole way. And until there are tangible and real sort of, I think, side effects to some of those risks and more people speak out, this is the way we'll get.
That was Nine's Chief Political Editor, Charles Croucher, speaking with me there. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So is sharing our social posts. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And don't forget, Tash will be back in your feeds this afternoon from 4 p.m. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.
Listener.